Two nations, one sea apart. But look closer at the surnames, the accents, the music, even the legends, and something strange starts to happen. The lines blur. You'll find Scottish clans claiming Irish roots, Irish castles with Scottish names, DNA results that flip family stories upside down, and ancient myths that speak the same language, word for word, on both sides of the water. Coincidence? Or something far older and far more connected than anyone realized? Because the deeper you dig, the more the facts refuse to stay in neat boxes. It turns out the truth isn't in a textbook or a tourist guide. It's buried under turf, woven into surnames, and, yes, even etched into your chromosomes. So, are Scottish and Irish people actually related? Not just culturally, not just spiritually, but in blood? The answer is more complicated and more astonishing than any simple yes or no. And it starts long before either country even had a name. Before we dive into this buried mystery, what's your theory? Were these lands always linked, or did time just make them look alike? Tell us in the comments. And if you're someone who wants more than surface-level history, who loves stories buried in DNA, stone, and memory, subscribe to Stone and Bone. We don't just tell history, we unearth it. Long before anyone called it Ireland or Scotland, there were no clans, no kings, no languages we'd recognize, just land, ice, and the first people bold enough to venture into it. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age drew to a close, glaciers that had once smothered much of Europe began to melt. Rivers surged, forests spread, and new frontiers opened up. That's when the first humans arrived. Small bands of hunter-gatherers who tracked animals and followed the seasons. Some came by foot when sea levels were low, others by simple boats made from hides and timber. These early settlers didn't know they were founding nations. They weren't Irish or Scottish, but their genes, passed from one generation to the next, became the roots of both. Scientists now know that these first islanders shared more than just terrain. They carried the same ancient mitochondrial DNA, specifically haplogroups like H, U5, and K, traced through maternal lines. These markers still appear in both modern Irish and Scottish populations today. That means the first women who gave birth in these harsh forested lands were the shared mothers of both peoples. Back then, the Irish Sea wasn't always a barrier. It was a passage. The coastlines were different, the world quieter. People moved back and forth freely, bound not by nations, but by survival, kinship, and the pulse of the land. Archaeological finds tell a similar story. Stone tools found in Ireland closely match those from early Scotland. Caves in both places hold signs of the same rituals, the same methods of fire, hunting, burial. These were sister communities long before the concept of community had even fully formed. So when we ask whether the Scottish and Irish are related, the truth is, their connection began before either group had a name. Before the Celts, before the clans, before language even carved meaning into the world. They weren't neighbors. They were the same people, separated only by time, tide, and the stories that came later. Language doesn't just describe the world, it remembers it. And if you trace the words spoken in ancient Ireland and Scotland, you'll find they don't just sound similar. They come from the same ancestral voice. Long after the first settlers built their camps and honored their dead, a new wave of influence swept across the islands, the Celtic languages. But even that word, Celtic, hides complexity. Centuries ago, tribes speaking an ancient Indo-European language moved westward through Europe. One branch broke off and settled in the British Isles. Over time, that tongue evolved into what we now call Insular Celtic, which split into two families: Brythonic, spoken in places like Wales and Cornwall, and Goidelic, or Gaelic, spoken in Ireland and eventually Western Scotland. This matters because while Irish and Scottish people are often treated as separate today, their linguistic roots say otherwise. The original form of Gaelic, Old Irish, developed in Ireland first. But by the 5th century AD, Gaelic-speaking settlers from the Irish kingdom of Dal Riata began crossing the sea and establishing themselves in what's now Western Scotland. They didn't just bring cattle and weapons, they brought their language, their oral traditions, and their gods. And that's where the connection deepens. For centuries afterward, Irish and Scottish Gaelic remained so similar that poets, priests, and kings could easily understand each other. The bards of one land could recite verses in the other without translation. Entire libraries of early Scottish legal texts were written in Irish Gaelic. Even today, many of the words remain nearly identical. The word for mountain, bain in both. Lake, loch, clan, the very terms used to describe family, nature, and spirit. Shared, not borrowed. It's not just about vocabulary. It's about worldview. These languages encoded values, kinship, honor, ancestry that both peoples lived by. Eventually, isolation and political pressures pushed the languages apart. Irish Gaelic became its own branch. Scottish Gaelic developed regional quirks. But underneath the accent and spelling differences, the foundation remains the same. And if language remembers what borders forget, then Gaelic proves something powerful. That long before flags were raised and lines were drawn, the Irish and Scottish spoke with one voice. If language tied the Irish and Scottish together, it was bloodlines that sealed the bond. Most history books focus on kings and warriors, but in early Celtic society, it was the family that ruled first, not just through men, but through the power of mothers, sisters, and daughters. And this is where the shared story between Ireland and Scotland becomes intimate. The ancient kingdom of Dal Riata, which stretched from northeastern Ireland into western Scotland, wasn't just a political extension, it was a dynastic web, stitched together by intermarriage and strategic kinship. Gaelic nobility didn't see the Irish Sea as a border. It was a bridle path, a route between cousins, allies, and future kings. Royal families married across the sea to forge alliances, claim land, and secure peace. These weren't just symbolic unions, they were deliberate genetic mergers. And unlike later feudal systems that prioritized only male heirs, early Gaelic succession often valued maternal lineage. A king's right to rule wasn't just tied to his father, it often depended on the nobility of his mother's bloodline. Modern genetic research backs this up. When scientists analyze mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down from mother to child, they find strong continuity between Ireland and Scotland, especially in ancient burial sites near the coasts. This isn't coincidental. It's a record of centuries of cross-sea marriages, of Irish princesses becoming Scottish queens, and vice versa. Even the famous unifier of Scotland, Kenneth MacAlpin, who brought together the Gaelic Scots and the Pictish tribes in the 9th century, may have had both Irish and Pictish ancestry. His rise wasn't just military, it was also maternal. His claim worked because his family spanned both sides of the sea. And it wasn't only elites. Across generations, ordinary clans intermarried. Fishermen, farmers, and warriors settled on new shores, bringing their customs and children with them. Over time, the distinctions blurred, not just politically, but genetically. So while most history tells of separations, this part of the story tells of fusion, of bloodlines flowing back and forth like the tides that carried them. And if surnames can lie, mitochondrial memory never does. It remembers the women who crossed oceans, the marriages that weren't recorded in stone, and the kinship that didn't need a treaty. Ireland and Scotland didn't just trade culture. They shared ancestry, not as neighbors, but as family. History is full of gaps. Stories lost to time, records burned or buried. But DNA remembers what the scrolls forgot. And if you want proof that Irish and Scottish people share more than a sea between them, you won't find it in flags or folklore, you'll find it in their cells. Most popular ancestry stories focus on Y-DNA, the paternal line passed from father to son. One marker in particular, R1b M222, has been found at high frequencies in both Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. This specific genetic signature is often tied to the descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages, a legendary Irish king whose lineage may have crossed into Scotland through the kingdom of Dalriata and beyond. In fact, some estimates suggest up to 3 million men today might carry his Y-chromosome signature, but Y-DNA is just one thread in the story. When researchers look at mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed from mother to child, they find the same pattern. Shared maternal haplogroups like H1, J1, and U5b appear frequently in both populations. These maternal lines are among the oldest in Europe and have been found in ancient remains on both Irish and Scottish soil. Even more compelling is what's revealed by autosomal DNA, the kind tested by services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. This genetic material comes from all your ancestors, not just one line. And in regions like Ulster in Northern Ireland and Argyll in Western Scotland, the genetic profiles are nearly indistinguishable. That's not speculation. That's measurable, quantifiable similarity. Shared markers passed down for thousands of years through marriages, migrations, and blended bloodlines. It's not just that Irish and Scottish people share DNA. It's that in many places, they're so closely related, they can't be told apart at the genetic level. Even in the diaspora, places like Nova Scotia, Appalachia, and parts of Australia, you'll find communities with interwoven Irish-Scottish ancestry. Entire family trees whose roots began on both shores, long before ships set sail. So while surnames changed and languages evolved, the genetic legacy remained steady. Because DNA doesn't care about political borders or old grudges. It only knows what it was built to do. Remember who we came from. Ancestry isn't just made of DNA. It's also shaped by the stories we're told to remember, and the ones we're punished for telling. As Ireland and Scotland evolved, so did their shared struggle. But this time, it wasn't migration that defined them. It was resistance. Starting in the medieval period and intensifying through the 16th and 17th centuries, both peoples faced a common threat: English expansion. And with it came new laws, foreign rulers, and a systematic campaign to suppress native culture. But not all battles were fought with swords. Many were fought in churches, songs, and whispered prayers. Ireland and the Scottish Highlands both leaned heavily into Catholicism, which had long been interwoven with older local customs. Saints replaced gods, but sacred wells and holy mountains remained. When Protestantism spread through England and the lowlands of Scotland, it wasn't just a religious shift. It became a political weapon. Gaelic-speaking Catholics were now painted as backwards, dangerous, even treasonous. In Ireland, laws banned Catholic education and land ownership. In Scotland, particularly after the failed Jacobite uprisings, Highland culture was dismantled. Kilts were banned. Gaelic was forbidden in schools. Clans were disarmed. It wasn't just cultural suppression. It was identity erasure. Yet in both lands, the old ways didn't vanish. They went underground. Hedge schools in Ireland taught Catholic doctrine in secret. Traveling bards in the Highlands preserved oral history through poetry and song. And across both regions, resistance became more than rebellion. It became a spiritual duty. To speak Gaelic, to sing the old songs, to pass on a surname that once carried power, all of it became an act of quiet defiance. Even their heroes often mirrored each other. Irish legends like Brian Boru, who resisted Viking invasion, found echoes in Scottish figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, who fought for independence from England. These were men who rose from their people, not above them, symbols of a collective will to remain unbroken. So while faith divided some parts of the Isles, it also created a common ground of survival. In the face of invasion, exile, and assimilation, both Irish and Scottish identity were forged not just in battle, but in belief. Because sometimes staying who you are becomes the greatest rebellion of all. A name can be a shield, a story, or a map. And in the case of Irish and Scottish surnames, it's often all three. Long before standardized spelling or official records, people were identified by their clan, parentage, or place of origin, and many of the names still common today carry echoes of a shared Gaelic past. In Ireland, prefixes like O and Mac or Messe held powerful meaning. O meant descendant of, like O'Neill, descendant of Neil. Mac or Mech meant son of, like McCarthy, son of Carthy. These weren't just names. They were living links to an ancestor, spoken aloud in every introduction. Scotland, too, adopted the Mac prefix across nearly all Highland clans. MacDonald, MacGregor, Mackenzie, these names marked not just lineage, but loyalty. A clan was more than a family. It was a political unit, a war band, a network of protection and belonging. And many of those clans didn't originate solely in Scotland. Some, including MacNeil and MacLachlan, have deep roots in Irish nobility who settled in Scotland centuries earlier. As families moved across the narrow sea, their names came with them, but so did variations. O'Cathan in Ireland became Cain, or Keen in parts of Ulster and Scotland. Macgiola Fadraig became Fitzpatrick, a name that later spread through both countries and far beyond. Some surnames appear identical in both Ireland and Scotland, yet arose independently, like Burns or Boyle, while others clearly branched from the same origin, changing spelling with time and dialect. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, as people fled famine, war, and economic collapse, these names crossed oceans. In places like Nova Scotia, Appalachia, and New York City, Irish and Scottish immigrants often lived side by side and intermarried. Their children might carry an O'Connor first name and a MacDonald last name, or speak with an American accent while bearing the legacy of two nations tangled in a single surname. So if your family name begins with Mac, or O, you're not just holding onto a label. You're holding a fragment of history, a signpost pointing across generations, across water, and across the intertwined lives of two ancient peoples. Names may change over time, but the stories behind them never stop traveling. No matter how deep your roots, there comes a time when the soil no longer holds you. For the Irish and the Scottish, that time came not once, but again and again. In the 18th and 19th centuries, both peoples faced relentless pressure. The Irish were crushed by poverty, famine, and the long shadow of colonial rule. The Great Famine alone forced over 1 million to flee between 1845 and 1852. The Scots, especially those in the Highlands, faced the Highland clearances, where families were evicted en masse to make room for sheep farming and land profits. What they shared wasn't just suffering, it was movement. They packed what little they had and boarded ships, many never to return. But what they carried wasn't just material. They brought language, even if fading. They brought music, fiddles, pipes, and haunting ballads. They brought stories, passed down at kitchen tables and in crowded boarding houses. And they brought their surnames, their clan pride, their refusal to forget who they were. In cities like Boston, New York, and Chicago, Irish and Scottish communities often settled side by side. In Nova Scotia, the name means New Scotland, but walk into an Irish pub in Halifax and you'll feel the overlap instantly. In Appalachia, the fusion became even tighter. Accents, songs, and family traditions blending across mountains and generations. Many descendants in these regions don't just have mixed ancestry. They have no idea which part came from where. One great-grandparent might be from Galway, another from Glencoe. But the Sunday dinner, the family crest on the wall, the love of a good story, they all come from the same Celtic heart. Even today, DNA tests often reveal what history forgot. A person who thought they were fully Irish turns out to be 30% Scottish. Or someone who flew a Scottish flag at their grandfather's funeral discovers strong Irish roots going back centuries. Because by the time they crossed oceans, Irish and Scottish identity had already blurred. Not erased. Not replaced. Blended. The diaspora didn't dilute their heritage. It expanded it. A legacy that once lived in the hills and glens now echoes in city blocks, prairie towns, and coastal villages around the world. No matter where they went, they took home with them, and they made sure that home would never be forgotten. You can share blood and still grow into something entirely your own. For all their common history, the Irish and Scottish didn't remain carbon copies. In fact, what makes their relationship so compelling isn't just the overlap. It's the way they diverged. Start with language. Yes, both spoke forms of Gaelic, but over time, isolation and suppression pushed the tongues in different directions. Today, Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are still close, but distinct. One spoken in pockets of Western Ireland, the other surviving in corners of the Scottish Highlands and Hebrides, like siblings who moved to separate cities and picked up different accents. Then there's religion. Both peoples were shaped by Christianity, but not in the same way. Ireland, long a stronghold of Catholicism, fused faith with national identity, especially in the face of colonial pressure. Scotland, meanwhile, saw deep internal divisions. The Lowlands turned Protestant early on. The Highlands, many of which remained Catholic or Episcopalian, became targets for cultural erasure. Even music and myth began to reflect their growing differences. Irish music leaned into rhythmic reels and rebellious ballads. Scottish tunes took on sweeping pipe marches and melancholic airs. Their heroes diverged too. Cuchulainn in Ireland, a demigod warrior, versus William Wallace, the defiant guardian of a real-world nation. Yet despite all this, something held steady. Their Celtic core. A love for the land. A fierce sense of honor. A belief that stories are sacred and that names, real names, carry the soul of a people. They're like two ancient trees that sprouted from the same root system, grown in different directions, weathered by different storms, but still drawing strength from the same soil. And when they meet, through marriage, music, migration, or memory, there's often an instant recognition. Not because they're identical, but because something ancient echoes between them. A glance, a phrase, a song heard for the first time that still feels familiar. They are not just connected by history. They are bound by something older. The drive to remember, to resist, and to pass on what others tried to take away. So yes, Irish and Scottish people are different, but they are not strangers. They are cultural twins, raised apart, but always part of the same story. After all the migrations, myths, and modern science, the answer is clear. Yes, Irish and Scottish people are related, not just in a vague cultural sense, but through shared ancestry, genetic markers, linguistic roots, and centuries of intertwined history. They came from the same Ice Age pioneers. They spoke the same ancient language. They built kingdoms that stretched across the sea, married into each other's clans, and stood side by side in rebellion and exile. They crossed oceans carrying the same songs, the same surnames, the same grief, and planted that legacy across the world. But here's what matters just as much. They also grew apart, and in doing so, they became two proud, distinct peoples, each shaped by their own storms, but forever carrying the imprint of the other. If you've got a Mac, or O in your name. If your grandmother made soda bread and your grandfather wore a tartan sash. If your DNA test says 40% Irish and 30% Scottish and you're not sure which is which, you're not caught between two histories. You're part of one story, just told from two sides of the same sea. Enjoyed the journey? Give this video a like to help others uncover their roots. Subscribe to Stone and Bone for more untold ancestry stories that live in your blood and breathe through time. And in the comments, tell us, does your family carry both flags? Or maybe just one, but with secrets buried beneath the other? We want to hear your story.